This week on Jerusalem Dateline, terror groups are emboldened as the Taliban completes its takeover of Afghanistan. Where will it lead? And Israel and Poland at odds over a law preventing Holocaust survivors from claiming property. Plus, Jerusalem Rising, a new book chronicling Jerusalem's prophetic story in photos. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this week's Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Julie Stahl, filling in for Chris Mitchell. All eyes have been on the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan and the speedy Taliban takeover. Now Afghanistan could once again become a breeding ground for terrorism since the Taliban declared full control over the country. Thousands are trapped and trying to escape, including Americans. Here's CBN News national security correspondent Caitlin Burke with more.
In a press briefing, the Pentagon said it now has the ability to evacuate 5,000 to 9,000 people a day from Kabul airport. While those efforts continue around the clock, counterterrorism experts warn about who's flooding into Afghanistan.
And this is the Taliban checkpoint. They are taking the security off the street.
There is real concern that with the Taliban back in charge of Afghanistan, that al-Qaeda is going to be able to rebuild its networks in that country.
Nathan Sales is the former ambassador-at-large and coordinator for counterterrorism at the State Department. He says one of the terms of President Trump's deal with the Taliban was that they break all ties with al-Qaeda. They haven't done that.
Just a couple of weeks ago, the United Nations released a report about the relationship between Taliban leaders and al-Qaeda. Unfortunately, that relationship remains robust.
Many foreign services and intelligence officials believe the Taliban's victory has re-energized other jihadists around the world.
Unfortunately, the stage really has been set for al-Qaeda to reassert itself in Afghanistan, to our detriment.
Previous intelligence estimates suggested it would take up to 2 years after a full U.S. withdrawal before al-Qaeda could again pose a threat to the United States. Sales tells CBN News the Taliban victory changes everything.
They see Afghanistan as the site of a great victory. They will try to pull recruits into Afghanistan to fight for them in much the same way that ISIS was a magnet for jihadists from around the world into Syria and Iraq several years ago. Al-Qaeda is going to take a page out of that playbook and look to reconstitute their networks there.
The intelligence community has been warning the Biden administration that pulling forces there would hurt our ability to contain extremist threats. Biden, though, maintains counterterrorism efforts don't require boots on the ground.
In order to do counterterrorism, you need to have intel. You need to know where the bad guys are located, and you need to know what they're plotting. And in order to collect that information, you need to have drones flying overhead, vacuuming up signals intelligence. And you also need to have a network of spies, human intelligence assets, who are collecting information.
A U.S. presence in Afghanistan offered reassurance to our assets on the ground that they would have protection if they were discovered. With our withdrawal, Sales says those abilities have been eliminated outright or dramatically reduced.
Israel's enemies are already using the hasty U.S. pullout from Afghanistan against the Jewish state, and they're wasting no time in taking action.
The minute that Biden declared his withdrawal, the Taliban immediately declared victory before anything else happened. And that was echoed by jihadists all around the world, and they've been encouraged and inspired by this.
Colonel Richard Kemp, former British commander in Afghanistan, sees Afghanistan becoming a major training ground for terrorists to attack the West.
From those two things of having a safe haven again for terrorism, which we had tried to prevent by a 20-year campaign, and secondly, by empowering and inspiring jihadists all around the world, I think we are now about to enter a situation where the terrorist threat will be at least as high from Afghanistan as it was from the Islamic State when it controlled vast swathes of territory in Syria and in Iraq.
And for Israel, the threat is immediate. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah says U.S. behavior during the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan indicates the moral downfall of America. They evacuated the dogs who worked in the security forces, but not those who aided them. They took out their equipment but left the human beings behind. These are the Americans. Nasrallah called on those living in the region to draw specific conclusions from the Taliban victory. Then within hours, the Iranian-backed terrorist issued a warning about an oil tanker departing Iran bound for Lebanon.
The tanker is coming from Iran and will sail in a few hours. I tell the Americans and Israelis that this is Lebanese territory.
Earlier, senior Hamas official Musa Abu Marzouk praised the Taliban victory in a tweet. They confronted the Americans and its agents and refused to compromise with them. They were not deceived by bright headlines about democracy and elections. Hamas delivered another message in the form of a rocket, the first since May's 11-day war with Israel. While touring the site, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett sent his own message.
We will operate at a time, a place, and in conditions that suit us, and not anyone else. As far as we're concerned, the address in Gaza is Hamas, not rebellious groups or anybody else, only Hamas.
On Facebook, opposition leader Benjamin Netanyahu posted about being invited to Afghanistan in 2013 by then Secretary of State John Kerry. The message was clear. The Afghanistan model is the model the United States seeks to implement in the Palestinian matter as well. I politely refused the offer. I estimated then that once the U.S. leaves Afghanistan, everything will collapse. We will get the same result if, God forbid, we deliver the homeland to the Palestinians. To hear more about the situation in Afghanistan, CBN founder Pat Robertson talked with CBN senior correspondent George Thomas, who has made several trips to Afghanistan since the U.S. invasion.
George, the Taliban treatment of women has been horrific. What's this move about inviting them to join the government? Is that for real?
Yeah, exactly. Is that for real? We both know that is not for real. This is window dressing, Pat. Wait for the between 5,000 to 10,000 Americans to finally be evacuated from Afghanistan. Wait for the 6,000 troops that are now controlling the Hamid Karzai International Airport, as well as the other NATO troops. Trust me, once all of our forces are out, all of our Americans are out, then the real crackdown begins. This is window dressing. There is no way. This is a 7th century medieval group that believes that women are second-class citizens. There is no way that they're going to allow women to participate in the governing process in Afghanistan. The reality is that in the next few weeks, months, we are going to see the severity of this group and what they believe in. And this is Islamic Sharia law. Let's not kid ourselves. 20 years later, this is a group that wants to take vengeance. And in fact, there are reports today that over the last 20 years, the United States, as well as our coalition forces, created a biometric database of all the Afghan security forces that participated with coalition forces, as well as Afghan special forces, including NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that worked for the betterment of Afghanistan, including women, including Christians. The reports are that the Taliban now has the entire biometric data list. In fact, there are reports as we come on the air today that from Herat to Mazar-e-Sharif to Kandahar to Kabul, Taliban are going door to door, checking with them. They have in their hands the biometric information, looking for people, those who worked with the Afghan government and those who worked with the United States these past 20 years.
Biden has done something, it seems to me, rather foolish. He's putting more troops into the embassy. I mean, how are they ever going to get out?
We only had about 2,500 troops prior to a few weeks ago. Suddenly we have this influx. If you are all concerned about getting troops out, why would you have this massive, influx of troops? This is going to be the challenge. And to tell you, Al-Qaeda today, from the streets of Sweden to Yemen to Saudi Arabia to Iraq to the deserts, sands of Morocco, all the way to Pakistan, Al-Qaeda and all of the various alphabet soups of terrorist organizations are praising what has happened. In fact, a major group that monitors traffic and chatter amongst the insurgent groups, the Al-Qaeda groups, said jihadists have portrayed the Taliban conquest of Afghanistan as a watershed event akin to the 9/11 events.
Coming up, a new Polish law prevents Holocaust survivors from reclaiming properties lost in the Holocaust. diplomatic dispute erupted between Israel and Poland over a new law that prevents Holocaust survivors from reclaiming property lost in the Holocaust. Poland's prime minister says Israel is overreacting, but Israel wants Poland to realize such laws are not acceptable.
Poland, not for the first time, approved an anti-Semitic and immoral law.
And in retaliation, Israel recalled its top diplomat with no plans to send its new ambassador to Warsaw. Foreign Minister Lapid also recommends the Polish ambassador to Israel stay on vacation.
He should use the time available to him to explain to the Poles what the Holocaust means to the citizens of Israel and how much we will not tolerate contempt for the memory of those who perished and the memory of the Holocaust.
Lapid says Israel and the U.S. are coordinating a response.
Poland has become an anti-democratic, non-liberal country that does not honor the greatest tragedy in human history. Never be silent. Israel and the Jewish people will certainly not remain silent.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged the Polish president to veto the legislation, saying it would severely restrict the process for Holocaust survivors and their families, as well as other Jewish and non-Jewish property owners, to obtain restitution for property wrongfully confiscated during Poland's communist era. Poland's foreign ministry called the move seriously damaging to the relationship and said it would take appropriate political and diplomatic actions. Lapid shot back that Israel had no intention of turning a blind eye to what he called the shameful conduct of the anti-democratic Polish government. Lapid's father and Blinken's stepfather were both Holocaust survivors.
The message it sends to Holocaust survivors, to descendants of Holocaust survivors, and to non-Jews. And because there are many Christian Poles who also had property, it says the past doesn't matter. It's not important. And we're not going to look and see what happened. We're not going to address it. We're just going to say there are no more claims. Everything is settled. Everything is closed.
Gideon Taylor of the World Jewish Restitution Organization says you can't build a house on that kind of foundation.
Poland never passed any legislation that enabled people to file a claim and to come forwards. Unlike other former communist countries, Poland has said, we're not going to deal with this.
Before World War II, Poland was home to nearly 3.5 million Jews, Europe's largest Jewish community at the time. 90% of them died in the Holocaust, and their properties were confiscated. While the incoming communist government kept those properties following the war, the fall of communism in 1989 opened the door for the properties to be reclaimed. Taylor says he believes Poland is afraid to look at its history.
Poland has said, we don't want to be responsible for what the Nazis did. And they're right. Poland suffered horribly under the Nazis. But this is not about that. This is about what the Polish communist government did after the war, when it took the property of Holocaust survivors and others, and non-Jewish Poles, and confiscated it.
Taylor says Israel and the U.S. won't let the issue drop. Poland, he says, needs to make some compensation for the loss. Tragedy outside Jerusalem as officials are saying arson, probably terror-related, is behind one of the largest fires in Israel in decades. The massive wildfire raged in the wooded hills outside Jerusalem for more than 2 days. High temperatures, dry weather, and winds fueled the giant blaze. 10,000 people were evacuated from their homes and a psychiatric hospital, but thankfully no one died. On the first day, the main Jerusalem-Tel Aviv road was temporarily closed, and the flames sent a massive cloud of smoke into Jerusalem miles away, darkening the skies and leaving an acrid smell. More than 6,000 acres of forest went up in smoke. Up next, a new book that takes an historic and prophetic look at the ageless city of Jerusalem. The new book, Jerusalem Rising, takes an historical and prophetic look at the ageless city. As Chris Mitchell reports, the author seeks to tell an ancient story through a modern lens.
Author Doug Hershey uses past and current photographs to show the extraordinary transformation of Jerusalem over the past 175 years. The book continues Hershey's unique look at prophecy and the Holy Land.
Much like Israel Rising documented the revival of the land, Jerusalem Rising is documenting the fulfillment of, or at least the beginning processes of these biblical prophecies about Jerusalem being restored and what it's leading to.
Hershey and adventure photographer Eden Ram comb the city for just the right angles to capture its past and present.
Eden climbed up top. There he goes. Looking at, you can kind of look through the fence here. It'll look better when you see the actual photos, but some of all of that stuff right in there is what he's getting a shot of from back in the early 1900s.
To be able to go to some of these locations and find the exact locations where a photographer set up 175 years ago to capture what Jerusalem looks like, and then go back today to the exact same location. Some of the oldest photos of Jerusalem ever taken were from 1844, and we have several of those in Jerusalem Rising, and all of those I don't think have ever been recreated ever.
One of those before and after photos takes place here, just outside the Jaffa Gate of Jerusalem's old city walls. It looks back from this spot towards what's known as the Tower of David. Hershey says most any city on earth may look different over the course of 100 years, but Jerusalem is unique.
There's no other city on earth that's had its history foretold, from its destruction to its desolation to a revival as a world player. So to be able to see all of that beginning to unfold in our day is really amazing. And so that's a lot of what's been documented in Jerusalem Rising.
Hershey says some of those prophecies can be seen on the streets here.
In Zechariah 8, God says that he's going to return to the city and he's going to dwell with his people, which is a profound statement for one of the prophets to say, that God's saying, I'm going to return to Jerusalem and dwell with my people. He says that the old men and old women will dwell safely in the streets, leaning on their canes, and the children will be playing in the streets, and the nations will begin to flood to Jerusalem.
And before COVID, Israel set records for tourism.
Never before in history have the nations flooded to Jerusalem the way that they are in our day. And now, clearly in Zechariah 8, it's in the context of coming to worship the King in Jerusalem, but it's undeniable that these are very beginning stages, historically, that we're seeing unfold in the city that have just never happened before.
Hershey says if we want to understand Jerusalem, we must look to the Scriptures.
Ultimately, if we continue reading the Scriptures, if we believe what the prophets said, Jerusalem is going to be a seat of ruling power for a Jewish king. Ezekiel 5:5 says that God has placed Jerusalem in the center of the earth. So locationally, it's already in the center of the earth. And one day soon, and even beginning now, it's already becoming the center of the world's attention.
A city that for thousands of years has stood at the crossroads of history and prophecy.
Jerusalem has been conquered and reconquered multiple times. It's changed hands over 40 times. It's been completely leveled at least twice. There's been literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years where the city has just laid desolate, according to eyewitness accounts. Now we're at a time where things are starting to revive. So prophetic words from Zechariah 8 or Isaiah or any of these prophets about Israel, about Jerusalem, where once we thought were allegorical or spiritual or just abstract concepts, we're finding that God is doing exactly what he said. Never before have these prophecies been fulfilled in such a dramatic and significant way, and it's happening in our day in a really powerful and unique way.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, the Jaffa Gate, Jerusalem's old city.
Still ahead, singing the blessing over Afghanistan. You may remember how many Christians sang a song called The Blessing over their countries at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Believers from Afghanistan also sang over their country. We want to share part of that song with you now, because Afghanistan now needs the blessing more than ever.
لطف خدا با تو باشد و هزاران نسل‌هایتان فامیل و فرزندانتان او با تو است او با تو است حضور او در وجودت در کنارت و اطرافت دور و برت و در دلت او با تو است او با تو است
سحرگاهت و شامگاهت در ورودت در خروجت
در غمهایت شادیهایت او با تو است او با تو است او با تو است او با تو است
It's a powerful reminder to pray for the Christians and all the people of Afghanistan in this troubled time. And as always, remember to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. That's all for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And you can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And don't forget to sign up for our email blasts so you can continue to receive all of our exciting CBN content. I'm Julie Stahl. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.